They said the statue had watched over the square for nearly a century. Through weddings and funerals, storms and summers, generations had passed beneath her gaze. The Virgin Mary, carved from grey stone, hands folded, eyes lowered, as if forever whispering prayers no one else could hear. For the people of this small town, she wasn't just stone, she was memory, comfort, a quiet presence when everything else seemed to vanish. But not everyone believed. It was late one autumn afternoon when he arrived. Thomas Hale, 26 years old, sharp eyes, restless energy. He'd grown up 2 towns over, left for college in the city, and returned with something new: contempt. Where others saw faith, he saw weakness. Where they saw mercy, he saw myth. And when he spotted the statue, in the center of the square, framed by flickering candles and flowers left by trembling hands, he couldn't help himself. He laughed, a loud, cutting sound that made heads turn. "Stone," he said, tapping the base with his boot. "That's all this is. A rock. You bow to it, you leave flowers for it, you whisper to it, but it doesn't hear you. It doesn't care. It's nothing." The shopkeeper outside the bakery froze, bread basket in hand. 2 children walking home from school stopped mid-stride, eyes wide. And from the church steps across the square, an elderly widow named Ruth Delgado stood with her candle, ready to place it as she had every evening for the last 40 years. Her hand trembled, wax dripping onto her fingers, but she didn't let go. Thomas grinned, sensing their silence, feeding off it. He crouched at the base of the statue and snapped a photo with his phone. "Let me guess," he said mockingly, "if I post this online and say the Virgin blinked, you'll all believe it. A miracle, right? Maybe she'll even add me on Facebook." A few nervous chuckles slipped from the crowd, not from humor, but discomfort. No one spoke. Not yet. The widow set her candle down carefully, as though each movement mattered. She looked at him, not with anger, but with something heavier: sorrow. "You think you're mocking us?" she said softly, her voice barely carrying across the cobblestones. "But it isn't us you mock, it's her. And mercy has a way of answering mockery." Thomas scoffed. "Mercy? Answering? Come on. She's not going to climb off this pedestal and chase me down. She's just stone." The word echoed through the square, sharp as broken glass. The children shifted uneasily. The shopkeeper muttered something under his breath. Ruth crossed herself and whispered, "Mother of God, pray for us." Thomas shook his head, pocketed his phone, and walked off with a smirk. "Believe what you want. Just don't expect me to bow to carved rock." The square stayed quiet long after he left. The only sound was the soft hiss of candles flickering at the statue's feet, their flames trembling in the evening wind. And yet, there was a feeling among those who remained, an unease none of them could name, because mockery, when aimed at something sacred, doesn't always vanish into the air. Sometimes it lingers, sometimes it waits. And in this town, whispers would soon begin. Whispers that what Thomas had laughed at that day would not leave him untouched, because what began as laughter would turn into silence he couldn't explain. Thomas Hale had always worn his disbelief like a badge. In college, professors had applauded his sharp essays dismantling religion as myth dressed up as morality. Friends laughed as he parodied scripture in smoky dorm rooms, raising his glass like a preacher at the pulpit. To him, faith wasn't just wrong. It was weakness, a crutch for those too afraid to face a silent universe. And now, back in the town, where old traditions still clung like ivy on stone, he carried that same defiance. The Virgin Mary statue became his target, not because he feared her, but because she stood so boldly at the center of everything he thought absurd. Each evening, when townsfolk came with candles and quiet prayers, Thomas came too, but not with reverence, with mockery. One night, he leaned against the pedestal, striking a pose while his friend snapped a photo. In it, he raised his hands in mock prayer, a smirk stretched wide across his face. Another evening, he placed a soda can at the statue's feet, bowing dramatically, saying, "Look, she's blessed my drink." He shared every photo online with captions dripping in sarcasm. Hashtag Stone doesn't save. Hashtag Idle Watch 2025. His posts spread. Some laughed, others shook their heads. But in the town, the air thickened. At the bakery, people whispered, "He's pushing too far." At the diner, old men shook their heads. Mocking is one thing, but doing it here, before her, that's asking for trouble. And in the church, Ruth Delgado lit her candle each night, as she always had. She never looked at Thomas directly, but when asked what she thought, her reply never changed. "Mock her if you must," she whispered, eyes lowered. "But be ready for her answer." Some dismissed Thomas with sighs. "Ignore him," they said. "He'll get bored." But others feared. Not of Thomas, of what might answer him. This town had its stories, of sudden storms that turned just before reaching the square, of sick children healed after mothers left flowers at Mary's feet, of the night an unexplained light circled the statue when the church nearly closed its doors for good. Stories outsiders called coincidence, stories insiders called something else. And now, every cruel word Thomas hurled felt like a stone tossed into deep water, ripples unseen but inevitable. One evening, he raised the stakes, standing before a small gathering, children holding their mothers' hands, elders leaning on canes. He spread his arms wide, as if he were the preacher now. "Show me," he shouted. "If this statue is anything more than rock, let it move. Let it blink. Let it speak. Until then, you're all worshipping silence." Gasps rippled through the square. A boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "He shouldn't say that." The shopkeeper muttered, "Foolishness, dangerous foolishness." But Ruth Delgado only knelt, lowering her candle carefully at Mary's feet. She pressed her wrinkled hands together and murmured, barely above a breath, "Mother of mercy, hear him. And answer as you will." Thomas laughed, mistaking her prayer for surrender. "Still silence," he said, tapping the statue once more. "Still stone." The square fell quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't empty but waiting. And though Thomas walked away triumphant, his footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, there was an unease that clung to the people who watched him go. Because faith has a way of outlasting mockery. And when stone is mocked long enough, sometimes, just sometimes, it does answer. The first sign came on a Tuesday night. Thomas had returned to the square, this time armed with nothing more than his phone and a smug determination to prove once again how absurd it all was. He set the device on a bench, camera pointed squarely at the Virgin Mary statue. "All right," he muttered. "If there's anything to see, let the camera catch it." Hours later, when he replayed the recording in his apartment, the video seemed ordinary at first. Candles flickered, people came and went, whispering prayers he couldn't hear. But then, at the 50-second mark, the light shifted. For less than a second, a soft glow bloomed around the statue's face. Not firelight, not a passing car, but something pale and steady, almost like a lantern held from within. Then it vanished. Thomas froze. He rewound, played it again. The same impossible glow. His mind scrambled for answers. Lens flare, bad pixels, compression glitch. He convinced himself it was nothing. Still, that night, he barely slept, the phantom glow replaying in his mind. The second sign was harder to dismiss. On Wednesday, he lingered near the square while the townsfolk placed their candles. He had grown accustomed to mocking the ritual, snapping photos of half-melted wax, posting captions like, "Fueling the candle industry, one superstition at a time." But as he lingered, he noticed one candle, a thin, white taper at the base of the statue. He'd seen it lit at dusk. Hours later, as the night deepened, it was still burning. At first, nothing unusual, but then he realized the wax hadn't moved, the wick hadn't shortened. The flame was steady, as if time had passed around it and left it untouched. He crouched closer, hand hovering just above the heat. It was real fire, warm, alive, but the wax remained pristine, unbroken. "Cheap trick," he muttered, though his voice wavered. "Some special candle." Science, not miracle. Yet when he returned the next morning, long after rain had fallen, that same flame flickered, untouched by storm or time. By Thursday, the signs began to follow him into the silence of sleep. In his dream, he stood alone in the square. The cobblestones were slick, as if freshly washed by rain, but there was no sound of water. The statue towered above him, its eyes carved and sightless, seeming to watch. And then, for the first time, she moved, not in great dramatic gestures, but in the smallest shift. Her head lowered, her gaze settling on him. Thomas jolted awake, heart hammering. The room was dark. The digital clock glowed 3:33. He muttered into the stillness, "Just a dream. Nothing more." But deep down, he knew he had never dreamed with such clarity before. Still, he doubled down. The next evening, in front of the townspeople, he raised his voice louder than ever. "Coincidences. That's all this is. Candles don't melt. Bad wax. Lights on my video. Cheap technology. Dreams. Just my brain recycling nonsense. Nothing here is real." His laughter cut through the square like a blade. But fewer people laughed with him. Even those who didn't believe shifted uncomfortably, because they too had seen the candle that wouldn't die, the flicker of light in the recording he had foolishly shown to prove his point. And though Thomas mocked harder, his own nights grew longer. Every creak in his apartment sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to lean toward him. The town began whispering, "How many coincidences before you stop laughing?" And though he scoffed at their words, he could not stop hearing them. Because coincidence has an end, and Thomas was about to reach it. By Friday evening, the square was alive with murmurs. News of Thomas's mockery had spread beyond the town's narrow streets. Strangers began appearing at dusk, curious onlookers, journalists from nearby towns, even a handful of faithful who had heard whispers of a man challenging Mary. The Virgin's statue stood at the center, as it always had, weathered but serene, hands folded, eyes lowered toward the square. For decades she had endured storms, funerals, weddings, and silent prayers whispered in the dark. Tonight, she would endure something else. Thomas strode into the square with the swagger of a man determined to finish what he'd started. In one hand, he clutched a small paper bag. The crowd shifted as he passed, parents pulling children closer. The elder widow, the one who had tended the candles for 40 years, raising her trembling hands to her rosary. "All right," he called out, voice ringing across the cobblestones. You've had your little stories, your ghost candles, your holy light tricks. Let's settle this once and for all. From the bag, he pulled a handful of small stones, pebbles, rough and ordinary, the kind children skipped across streams. He turned them in his palm, with exaggerated slowness, letting the onlookers see. This statue, he declared, pointing at the Virgin Mary, is nothing more than carved stone. And stone, he tossed a pebble in the air, catching it, breaks. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Some gasped. Others muttered prayers. A teenage boy whispered to his friend he wouldn't dare. But Thomas dared. That was his role, his performance. He wound his arm back and let the first pebble fly. It struck the base of the statue with a hollow tack. The sound echoed louder than it should have, as though the whole square had been holding its breath. "There," Thomas shouted, triumphant. "Nothing happened. See? No thunder, no curse, just a rock hitting another rock." He hurled the second pebble, this time aiming higher. It glanced off the statue's robe, clattering down the steps. Again, nothing but the echo. "Two down," he laughed, though his laughter rang hollow, a little too sharp, a little too forced. The widow at the front clutched her rosary tighter, whispering words only she and God could hear. "Mock her if you must, but be ready for her answer." Thomas hurled the third stone with more force. It struck just below the statue's folded hands. The sound that followed was different, deeper, almost metallic, as if the stone had struck something more than marble. The crowd murmured, uneasy. Thomas blinked, shaking it off. "Still just stone," he insisted, though his voice cracked. And then it happened. A wind rose, sudden and sharp, sweeping through the square with no warning. Candles guttered, and yet did not go out. Loose papers flew from benches. The sound rattled windows, tore through the alleyways, and pressed against the people's chests like a great unseen hand. Thomas staggered, shielding his face. "It's just weather," he shouted, though his words were nearly swallowed by the gust. But the wind was not the strangest thing. Somewhere above the noise, a sound rolled across the square, 3 slow, deliberate tolls. A bell's voice, deep, resonant, ancient. The problem was, no bell tower stood within miles. The church at the edge of town had long since lost its steeple. The air itself seemed to carry the sound. The crowd froze. Mothers clutched children. Men who had scoffed only days ago fell silent. And the widow, her eyes glistening, whispered into the storm, "She speaks." Thomas's laughter died in his throat. His chest tightened, not with fear exactly, but with something heavier. A weight pressed down on him, as if the very air had thickened around his shoulders. He stumbled backward, pebbles spilling from his fist. His knees weakened. He tried to steady himself, but felt his legs wobble, as though unseen fingers had brushed against them. And then, for an instant that stretched into eternity, he looked up. The Virgin's carved eyes, stone, weathered, unchanged for decades, seemed different. Not moving, not alive, yet somehow no longer blank. They seemed to hold him. Not in anger, not even in judgment, but in sorrow. It was the weight of that gaze, the unbearable tenderness of it, that broke him more than the wind or the bell. Thomas fell to one knee, clutching his chest as if he'd been struck. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some thought he had fainted. Others thought he had been cursed. But Thomas knew what he felt. It was not death. It was not wrath. It was a silence so loud it swallowed every excuse, every laugh, every word he had ever spoken against her. The wind eased. The candles steadied. The bell was gone. The square fell into stillness again. But the crowd was not the same. Neither was Thomas. He pushed himself to his feet, face pale, eyes wild, though he forced a laugh. "Coincidence," he croaked, though no one believed him. His voice carried no conviction, not even to his own ears. He stumbled away from the statue, hands trembling, heart pounding, with a rhythm he could not explain. The townspeople parted silently to let him pass. Some looked at him with pity, others with awe. And the widow, watching him go, whispered one final time, "Be ready for her answer." Thomas walked into the night, but for the first time he carried no laughter with him, only the echo of tolling bells that no one could unhear. And though he would not admit it, he was shaken to his core. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He told himself it was nothing. The wind, the candle tricks, the echo of some distant bell. Rational explanations spun through his mind like lifelines, but none held long enough to steady him. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt again the weight of that gaze. Not of marble, not of stone, of something else. By midnight, the streets of the town were quiet, curtains drawn, lamps extinguished. Only the old square, with its silent statue, seemed to breathe in the dark. Thomas lay restless on the guest bed of the inn, his body exhausted, but his mind thrashing. Finally, sleep took him, and with it, the dream. He was back in the square, but it wasn't the same. The cobblestones glistened as if drenched in rain, though no storm had fallen. The air shimmered faintly, heavy yet calm. And there she stood, not towering, not radiant with blinding fire, as he might have expected from a vision. She was simply there, quiet, still, clothed in flowing robes of muted white and soft blue. Her hands folded, her eyes lowered, her face marked not with wrath, but with a sorrow so tender it nearly undid him. Thomas froze. His tongue, so sharp in waking life, seemed useless here. No words came, only the thudding of his heart against his ribs. She lifted her gaze slowly, and for the first time he felt what it meant to be seen. Not just looked at, not just judged, but laid bare, as though every scar, every wound, every sneer he had ever hurled was known to her. And yet, no anger lived in her eyes, only compassion. She spoke, and her voice was soft, almost fragile, a whisper that somehow filled the whole square. "Why do you wound what only wants to heal?" The words sank into him like water into dry earth. They were not accusation, they were not condemnation, they were invitation. Thomas fell to his knees in the dream, though he hadn't willed it. His body simply could not stand under that question. His lips parted, desperate to explain, to justify. I thought, he stammered, but the rest never came, because in her eyes, explanations shriveled, pride crumbled. She stepped closer, her bare feet touching the wet stones, though no sound followed. The air around her seemed to soften, as though grief itself bent beneath her presence. He wanted to look away. He couldn't. Mary raised one hand, not to strike, not to silence, but to extend, palm open, like a mother offering comfort to a trembling child. Thomas felt warmth radiate from it, a warmth that reached his chest, his throat, his eyes, and for the first time in years, tears burned down his cheeks, not of shame, but of something deeper, older. The silence between them was unbearable, yet holy. "Why, me?" His voice cracked. Mary did not answer with words this time. Instead, she tilted her head, as though reminding him that even doubt, even anger, even mockery had not placed him beyond reach. That mercy had always been waiting. He had only needed to stop laughing long enough to notice. The dream began to fade, not in a rush, but gently, like dawn dissolving night. Her figure blurred, her sorrowful eyes the last thing to vanish. Thomas woke with a start. His chest was heaving, his sheets damp with sweat. The clock on the bedside table glowed faintly in the darkness. 3:33 a.m. The same hour he'd heard whispered about since arriving. The same hour the widow had once muttered was, "When the veil thins." He sat up, trembling, his throat dry, his body clammy. He pressed a hand against his chest, as if to steady his own heartbeat. "It was a dream," he whispered, though the words shook. Just a dream. But when he turned his head toward the window, his breath caught. The square was visible from his room, the statue's outline dark against the moonlit cobblestones. And yet, it was not dark. The Virgin glowed faintly, not blazing, not theatrical, a soft, living radiance, pale as moonlight, but steady, as though the stone itself had caught fire from within. Thomas stumbled to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The glow pulsed gently, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. He wanted to call out, to wake the innkeeper, to prove he wasn't imagining it. But no voice left his throat. He only stared. The glow lasted a minute, maybe two. Then it faded, leaving the statue again what it had always been: weathered, silent stone. But Thomas knew. The dream had not been imagination. The glow had not been trick of the light. For the first time since he'd laughed in the square, he did not feel like the one mocking. He felt like the one being answered. And deep inside him, though he would not yet admit it aloud, a truth he had resisted pressed against his ribs like a flame refusing to go out. He was not alone. Morning came quiet over the little town. Mist lingered over the cobblestone square, clinging low to the ground like a veil. Shops were still shuttered, windows still dim. Only the sound of a lone sparrow broke the silence. And then came footsteps. Thomas. His stride wasn't the same as before. Gone was the swagger, the restless energy of someone who wanted to be seen. This time, his pace was measured, almost hesitant, like a man carrying something he couldn't set down. The statue loomed ahead, weathered and grey, her gaze lowered in perpetual prayer. To anyone else, she looked unchanged. But to him, she was no longer just stone. She was memory. She was question. She was presence. He stopped at the base. For a long moment, he simply stood, hands in his pockets, jaw clenched, as though every fiber of his being was resisting what his heart already knew. Then, slowly, almost awkwardly, he bent one knee. Gasps sounded behind him. The villagers had begun to gather, curious at the sight of the outsider back in the square. Shopkeepers opening shutters, children clutching their mothers' hands, the widow with her cane moving steadily to the front. They expected another speech, another cruel laugh, another stunt for his phone. But no words came. Thomas knelt fully now, both knees pressing into the damp stone, his head lowered. His body trembled, though not from cold. The square went silent. He drew in a shaky breath. His lips moved, but the words were faint. Only those nearest caught them. "I'm sorry." The widow clutched her rosary tighter, tears gathering in her eyes. A baker crossed himself without meaning to. A child whispered, "He's praying." Thomas placed something on the ground before the statue. His phone. The same device he had used to film his ridicule, to capture himself throwing insults, to prove to the world that faith was foolish. Now it sat screen down on the stone, abandoned. He raised his head slowly, his eyes locked on the statue's face, stone, unchanging, yet to him, alive. His voice cracked again. I don't know what you are. I don't know what I saw. But I can't laugh any more. A breeze swept across the square, faint but steady, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't fallen. The villagers shifted, but no one spoke. They didn't need to. They knew this was not a performance. This was surrender. Minutes passed, though it felt like longer. Thomas remained on his knees, his body still, his lips whispering words he had once sworn he'd never say. They weren't polished, they weren't scripted, but they were honest. Forgive me. The widow stepped forward. She didn't touch him, didn't speak, only laid a single candle at the statue's base beside his phone. Slowly, one by one, others followed. A shopkeeper with flowers, a child with a folded drawing, a farmer with a handful of grain. By the time Thomas finally rose, the base of the Virgin Mary was ringed not just with offerings, but with a silence so profound it felt sacred. He turned, his eyes red, his face pale, and for the first time since arriving in the town, there was no arrogance in his expression, no pride, only humility. The villagers didn't cheer, they didn't scold, they simply nodded, acknowledging what had happened. Something unexplainable, something undeniable. Thomas walked away without a word, but his phone remained. That evening, the widow returned to the square. The candles still flickered. The offerings still rested at the Virgin's feet. She bent slowly to pick up the phone Thomas had left behind. When she lifted it, the screen lit up. A recording was still open, the one Thomas had started when he knelt. But the footage didn't show him. It showed only the statue, and in a single frame, just for an instant, the stone face seemed softer, the lips curved not in stone, but in something close to a smile. The widow pressed the phone to her chest, whispering through trembling lips, "Mercy." It wasn't about proof. It wasn't about argument. It wasn't about winning. It was about humility, about a man who laughed at faith until faith answered, not with wrath, but with a mother's sorrow, a mercy that asked only one question: why wound what wants to heal? And for the rest of his life, Thomas would never forget that question. Sometimes it isn't belief that finds us. Sometimes it's mercy. If this story touched you, share it, because the world needs to be reminded that even doubt can lead to grace.